We are going to tackle now the first novel in the course, Moll Flanders. It's seemingly straightforward. It looks easy to read. It appears to be a slice of life narrative. But in fact, you'll see it's filled with masks, disguise, lying, scheming. And at a key moment, Moll herself gets permission to visit a captured thief in Newgate Prison, a man whom in fact she has loved passionately, even though each one lied to the other about who they were. And she says to him, "Do you not know me?" And I want to introduce this lecture with that quotation. Do you not know me? It's a resonant question. Am I recognizable? Do I know myself? Do others know me? Or I could say you. Do you know yourself? These are going to be the existential issues at the core of both this early 18th century novel and the lecture that I'm going to give on it. Daniel Defoe has often been regarded as the father of English fiction, even though it's not a term you'd hear as much today. But he also inherits a tradition that existed before he wrote called the picaresque. And he's also, I think, in a great tradition of journalist writers. It goes all the way up to Tom Wolfe. Let me say a word about some of these terms. The picaresque is a form that goes back to Spanish fiction, comes from the Spanish word pícaro, which meant a rogue or a scoundrel. And these were novels that recounted the adventures and usually misadventures of pícaros, lowlifes, rogues, scoundrels, swindlers, con men. The most famous picaresque novels we have are The Lazarillo de Tormes from the mid-16th century and The Swindler from the early 17th century. Critics have often said about the picaresque novel that it doesn't have any shape, doesn't have any form or pattern. It's episodic. And I want to make that emphasis because that's the criticism that can also be leveled at Moll Flanders. Does it have any shape? Episodic can mean just additive, one adventure after the other. It's, from an aesthetic point of view, arguably a weakness in a work of art. But of course, the question that it seems to me that it points to is, does life itself have pattern? Or to be a little bit darker about it, is the pattern that we think our life has, the sort of pattern that we dredge up when we write our resumes and CVs, rather specious in comparison to the actual length and variety and perhaps picaresque nature, episodic nature of our own lives and time. The picaresque genre is also known for its bottom-up vision, a satirical vision. It writes about society from the point of view of people who were either on the outside or who were servants or con men. And one virtue of this genre is that it gives us a lens onto mainstream society and the operation of power that is very, very interesting and special. People on the bottom see things in a particular way. It's also a genre that's rich in information about what kinds of resources people without resources have, what trumps do people without trumps have. In other words, in the picaresque, you find people who have to be street smart, cunning, quick, deft, clever. And that is what we're going to see in Moll Flanders. The genre continues. It's been thought of as a 17th and 18th century genre, but in fact, we can see it in Huckleberry Finn, we see it in Invisible Man. So this is something that Defoe inherits. One senses that it's virtually natural to him. But I called him a journalist because in fact he wrote prodigiously, published prodigiously, on virtually all the issues of his age. Religious controversy, of which there was a great deal, but he wrote on subjects such as dueling, bankruptcy laws, insurance, care for the elderly, conditions for the mentally ill. He seems to have had a kind of inexhaustible energy or voracious curiosity. He's like a living Wikipedia, a living reference book. For the contemporary audience, not as clear that this is the case for readers today, his signature seems to be his plain style and his prosaic view of life, prosaic as opposed to poetic. And that plain style for them would have meant a style that was talking, unadorned, straightforward. In other words, it doesn't look literary, it doesn't look stilted, it's not Latinate, it doesn't have a lot of metaphors in it. Defoe, I think, can be seen as our great witness for changes that he did not fully know he was measuring. Those changes we now call the emerging new middle class. He celebrates in all of his novels enterprise, mercantilism, and hard work. As I said, he cannot have known the extent to which he was a barometric figure in which one could get a reading of the age and, I think, of what was to come in his own work. How he incarnates, again, I think without knowing it, a new set of values and beliefs. His view on industriousness and on making money has been linked, I think quite persuasively, to a thesis that's well known about Protestantism and the work ethic, which means that the focus in Defoe's books is on the individual, a feature again of Protestantism, but it's also a focus on this life. Doesn't have its sights so much on religious salvation or transcendence, and Defoe himself is fascinated by ingenuity, cunning, can-doism. One of the questions raised by his work, and I do not think it was raised for him, I think he didn't even worry about it, but we do when we try to interpret his work, is a very basic one. Is there a conflict between fattening your purse and saving your soul? As I say, this question remains with us today. I think it's just as unanswerable today. But it means that when we read Defoe, it's often difficult to know when the man is being ironic or not. Defoe is also a wonderfully commonsensical writer. And I'll refer to the book that all of you either know or have read, which is Robinson Crusoe, based on the real-life story of a man, Alexander Selkirk, who was abandoned on a desert island. Now just think about it for a minute. To write the story of a man abandoned on a desert island could have been a kind of nightmarish existential story of angst, of solipsis, of solitude, of a nervous breakdown. But in Defoe's hands, instead it becomes a story of homo economicus, of organizing the island, of laying out your time, of getting busy, of colonizing your world to some extent, of figuring out how to turn a profit. Defoe has a kind of self-help, how-to mentality. All of this I present as a kind of introduction for talking about Moll Flanders, which brings one more fascinating new element to the mix, which is that it has a female protagonist. Moll Flanders goes from the country to London. The story of innocent country people coming to London is a story that interested the reading public, the English reading public in the 18th century, because London itself was being transformed dramatically. Its population doubled between 1700 and 1750. It was becoming known as a thriving business capital. There is a marvelous sequence of prints in the mid-18th century by Hogarth called The Harlot's Progress, which has a lot of parallels with Moll Flanders. And Hogarth, the painter in mid-century, takes a rather dim critical view of country people coming to London and therefore being corrupted in the process. Harlots do not end up well in Hogarth. But we're going to see that Defoe's story of the country girl who comes to London, this so-called innocent girl who comes to London and receives her education, is far more open-ended. It's more ambiguous. It's harder to interpret. People have said that Moll is based on the real-life adventures of women criminals. Defoe, with his curiosity, went into prisons and interviewed criminals, men, but women too, and people have tried to trace who, in fact, was the actual sort of original. In his preface, Defoe claims that this is a moral story that he's telling. It's a story about remorse. Now, you should realize that the prefaces in most 18th century novels are to be taken with a grain of salt. That the novel itself is not a recognized genre with much dignity in the 18th century, so that every author had to outfit his novel with a kind of well-meaning, earnest moral preface about how this is really moral instruction. Well, he needed it for this book because Moll, who does not have, she's an orphan, she doesn't have papers, she doesn't have money. How can she possibly succeed in the London of her moment? At one point, she's laughed at for saying she wants to be a gentlewoman, and she's laughed at because how could she possibly become a gentlewoman in any caste sense of the term? But her answer is she didn't mean gentlewoman in that sense. She meant instead to have a measure of independence, to not to live in service. And what would her tools be for independence, for achieving that independence? And the only tools that seem to be available to her are her beauty, her body, her wit, her cunning. And so she goes through really two sets of endeavors. One, when she's younger, is trying to make a wealthy marriage, usually by appearing to be a woman with means, although not quite lying outright or directly. And once this phase gradually wears out, and it doesn't wear out fully, she's continuing to look for men right on through the book, she becomes a thief. Being a thief, by the way, is not easy work. It requires a lithe intelligence, wit. It requires open eyes and nimble fingers, seeing what's happening around you so that you can take advantage of it. This is all part of the can-doism. A successful thief would be a figure whom we might, in fact, judge harshly morally. But if we're interested in ingenuity, then, of course, a thief is going to look like a rather different kind of figure. A person who makes ends meet, a person who survives and does a bit more than surviving without really resources. Now, Moll's thefts, and in fact, for that matter, her efforts to get married, have a kind of obvious material stamp. It's as if the good life were determined by money in the person of a wealthy husband, or by money in the existence of the things that you could steal that are worth money, such as silver, or lace, or linen. These are the things that lard this book. Defoe is constantly recounting what Moll takes, what her sights are on. People have said these are the things that are measurable. And they are measurable, but of course most of us want to think that life consists of things that are not measurable too. And so the grand critique of Defoe's book is, well, what about what misses measure, such as soul, emotion, value? Is the only value the value in pounds or shillings? Moll has been thought of as a person who mouths moral values, moral principles, but in fact always has her eye out exclusively for the material things within her reach that she might steal. We have to remember that this is a kind of empiricist age. It's the age that's influenced by the logic of John Locke, by a new, again, this can also be linked to the rise of the middle class. Moll, therefore, has been construed as a kind of soulless figure, focused only on the here and now. And Defoe has been criticized as a person who is really not credible when he talks about anything else. What I want to suggest is that this book outruns those kinds of criticisms. If the book were only that, then I wouldn't have put it on my list as a classic. Let's first take a look at what it would sound like to be a person only interested in material things. This is what Moll sounds like after her first husband has died, a husband whom she never loved much in the first place. It concerns the story in hand very little to enter into the farther particulars of the family or of myself for the 5 years that I lived with this husband, only to observe that I had 2 children by him, and at the end of 5 years he died. Moll goes on to explain that he really had been a decent husband, but he hadn't had much money to begin with, and therefore he'd never made much money. And then she tells us in numbers exactly how much money he did leave her. And she closes by saying, "My 2 children were indeed taken happily off of my hands by my husband's father and mother, and that, by the way, was all they got by Mrs. Betty." And she calls herself Betty as well. And critics have said, is that what 5 years of marriage means? 2 children taken off your hands, X number of pounds or shillings. Surely there must be more to it than this. It's also the case, though, that Moll can tell us things about her existence with her husbands, with others, and that they go beyond the kind of surface or superficial reading that just was suggested. For example, one incident comes about when Moll, who is now a thief and is looking for the great event, how to make money, and she hears about a fire in London, and she rushes to the premises. People are fleeing this building, the servants are coming out, and Moll says, I am here because I want to help the gentlewoman who is trying to exit this building. I will take the children off your hands, I will take your precious valuables, your plate, your linen, your silver, and I will give it to her friend. And of course, she looks like this is a perfect rescue. This is also, as you can easily see, a perfect dodge. She takes the plate, the silver, the lace, she hands over the children to somebody else, and she walks off with the rest. And she expresses a certain amount of remorse, because among the things that she has taken are a wedding ring, memorabilia that obviously represent a great deal of emotional richness for the person who has lost this. And she says that this touched her even to her very soul. But then this paragraph follows, and it's one of the things that I love about this book. I say, I confess the inhumanity of this action moved me very much and made me relent exceedingly. And tears stood in my eyes upon that subject. But, and this is the Defoe signature, but, with all my sense of its being cruel and inhuman, I could never find it in my heart to make any restitution. The reflection wore off, and I began quickly to forget the circumstances that attended the taking them. It's as if Defoe were saying, remorse is real, it's just not very powerful. You have a heart, it's just not a very big or significant organ. That life itself makes us callous. Doesn't mean that we're deprived or without moral values, but that those values only come time to time to the surface to pinch us, tweak us, prod us, but for the most part, that's not how we live. This is the kind of unflinching honesty in this story, and it makes a lot of other books look awfully pretentious, hollow, postured. It's as if Defoe were saying, wait a minute, let's talk about the truth. How morally scrupulous is any life? That's the kind of integrity and honesty in this book. Now, Moll's sense of how to succeed, as I said, is linked to her dexterity, her wit, but I'm trying to suggest that it is not alien to a kind of inwardness also. For example, one of the episodes in the early part of the book, the husband that just died that I referred to, is a husband who was the younger brother in a family where she was working, and the older brother was her first lover. The older brother was dashing, handsome, he wooed her, he gave her money the first time they had sex, she didn't even know why he was giving her the money. She's wildly in love with him. He, of course, is never going to marry her. He's the older brother, he has his own fortune to make. But the younger brother takes her seriously, and in fact persuades, against their best wishes, the family to let him marry her. And he dies, and they are the ones who live together for 5 years, and then he dies. And she never did love him much, but this is what she writes. I confess I was not suitably affected with the loss of my husband, nor can I say that I ever loved him as I ought to have done, or as was proportionable to the good usage I had from him, for he was a tender, kind, good-humored man, as any woman could desire. But his brother, the one that she loved, his brother, being so always in my sight, at least while we were in the country, was a continual snare to me. And listen to this. This, to me, is just stunning what Defoe is writing. And I never was in bed with my husband, but I wished myself in the arms of his brother. And though his brother never offered me the least kindness that way, never made any approaches to me after our marriage, but carried it just as a brother ought to, yet it was impossible for me to do so to him. In short, I committed adultery and incest with him every day in my desires, which without doubt was as effectually criminal in the nature of guilt as if I had actually done it. Well, when you have a passage like that, you can't say that this is a superficial writer. Because think about it for a minute. The material scene, the superficial scene, the empirical scene, that is to say, Moll is in bed with her husband, that won't tell you what's happening. In her mind, in her libido, in her desire, she is in bed with his brother. And that's what plagues her. But that's probably also what gives her the pleasure that she experiences with this man. And what Defoe is showing us in this remarkable passage is that the world of surfaces is doubled, echoed, ghosted by a world of memories, a world of spirit, a world of our other relationships, that we bring those things, can't help bringing those things to the world we live in, importing them, exporting them, and this accounts for the kind of resonance and thickness of this book. Moll's success as a thief has to depend not only on her cunning, but her capacity for disguise. She disguises herself initially as a woman with means. She disguises herself later more boldly. She has to disguise herself. She cannot ever tell people who she really is, because there are many references in the book to thieves being identified, caught, and then hanged. Thieving is literally called a form of artistry in this book. Moll calls herself the greatest artist of my time. And we get the sense that being a thief is a remarkably creative activity. But we also get a sense that it can become obsessive. We watch it spiral out of control. At first she thieves as a woman of means, but then she joins professional groups of thieves, and she becomes bolder. She dresses as a beggar. She joins up with counterfeiters. She comes close even to stealing a horse. It's one of the really surreal moments of the book. What on earth does this woman need a horse for? Well, the reason you steal a horse is you're just that good that you might be able to pull it off. So there's almost a kind of professional pride in the thieving here. Disguise. I want to say a word about disguise. It's been argued, not by Defoe, but by people who came later, particularly by urban students of urbanology, that we live in some sense in disguise in the big, anonymous, big city. Let me put that differently. How many people do you know if you live in a large metropolis? Or let me put that differently. How many people in a large metropolis, in a large apartment building, even in a small apartment building, know you? Georg Simmel, the German sociologist who wrote about these things at the beginning of the 20th century, claimed that in fact the conditions of modern urban life are such that we quantify and reify our relationships with others, but they're also such that we have almost exclusively secondary relationships with the people that we deal with. The cab driver, the florist, the butcher, the baker, how much do they know about you? I don't want to outright call this disguise, but I'm getting at, again, how much do people know about you? How much do you know about them in the conditions of modern urban life? If you're a thief in London, and if people knew who you were, you could be hanged, then you become a kind of perfect test case for the virtues of invisibility, the virtues of being masked. Your inner life, your past, your reality has to be invisible. Now, when I say that, what I want to add is, it's true for all of us. No one knows our past. We don't wear it on our sleeves. Our history is not written on our forehead. It's in that sense that we are, for the most part, in drag in culture, in social life. We alone know who we are, what we've done, as we go through our paces. Most others neither know nor care. One of the marvelous moments in this book is when Moll has yet another lover who woos her, is desperate to marry her, insists on marrying her. She puts him off for a while, and finally she agrees to marry him, and I want to quote Defoe. "Then it occurred to me, what an abominable creature am I? And how is this innocent gentleman going to be abused by me? How little does he think that having divorced a whore," that's what this man has done, he's found out that his wife is sleeping around, "he is throwing himself into the arms of another." Listen to this grocery list as she describes herself, she describes her past, she describes all the things this suitor could not possibly know about her and must not know about her. So listen. He's going to marry one that has lain with 2 brothers, slept with, has had 3 children by her own brother. These are the goodies in the book that I haven't talked about. One that was born in Newgate, whose mother was a whore, and is now a transported thief. One that has slept with 13 men, and has had a child since he saw me. That's quite a list of things that you'd want to keep from your would-be husband, okay? Poor gentleman, said I. What's he going to do? After this reproaching myself was over, reproaching oneself usually goes over fairly quickly in Defoe, it followed thus. Well, if I must be his wife, if it please God to give me grace, I'll be a true wife to him and love him suitably to the strange excess of his passion for me. And here comes the kind of mathematical statement that is not just math. It's filled with values. It's filled with the kind of wisdom. Listen to it. I will make him amends, if possible, by what he shall see for the cheats and abuses I put upon him, which he does not see. That's an ethics. That's a code of conduct. And it doesn't just apply to Moll Flanders. That is a form of bookkeeping. It's a way of saying, no one can see my checkered past, and perhaps everyone's past is checkered, but I'm going to live in such a way that I will make amends to this man for his strange love for me. I will make amends for all of the cheats and abuses that he cannot see. I call this bookkeeping in the sense of keeping your own books, being aware of your own inner life, which is so usefully invisible when you're a thief, when you meet people, when you go through your paces, when you want to be a success. As I said, you don't wear it on your sleeve. You don't advertise it. Most of us tell other people things about our past that we edit, select, and frequently alter. The ugly stuff doesn't come out. What this book is doing is creating a kind of dialectic, a kind of balance between what is hidden, what is internal, what is never public, and putting it in relationship to our acts, our deeds, and the things that we actually speak and say to others. There is a kind of wisdom here, and it seems to me it's what obliges us to say that, well, disguise is part of this book, because we think of disguise as fake, inauthentic. Disguise is part of this book, but in fact, this is also a book that is stunningly honest, taking the measure of who we are over time. And the pendant to disguise in this book is confession. The book refers to many people confessing, and not just in church. Defoe writes about people in jail who have nightmares and who speak about the crimes they've committed. Moll herself is a person who is intensely social. Disguised though she may be, she needs other people. She needs people to share her experiences with, to be able to speak to, and she becomes blue, she becomes depressed. He even writes about it in physical terms. She'll use terms like hemorrhaging inwardly when she is condemned to be alone for too long a period of time. At a key moment in this passage, when she is finally, it has to happen, busted, taken to Newgate prison, the minister comes in and he speaks to her and he opens her up. This honest, friendly way of treating me unlocked all the sluices of my passions. He broke into my very soul by it, and I unraveled all the wickedness of my life to him. In a word, I gave him an abridgment of this whole history. In other words, narrative, story. She tells him her story. That is the single strongest imperative in this book. And I'd suggest that that's close to Defoe's legacy. The legacy is that our life is much longer than any of the shorthand versions we have for it. And the title of this novel is not Moll Flanders. It's the fortunes and misfortunes of the famous Moll Flanders, etc., who was born in Newgate and goes through the whole grocery list of things that she had done lain with so many people, daughter of a whore, etc., lived honest finally at the end, and died a penitent. That is the list of things that happen to someone who lives in time, and it suggests perhaps that all of us lead picaresque lives, and it makes that question, do you not know me? A hard question. Thank you.